Hey, how's it going, everybody? Been a little while since I made a video, but here I am trying to squeeze one out before the start of Crucible League. And today's video topic is about Atlas passive acquisition, with a heavy focus on completing your maps. And so, I figured this is a good piece of content to put out there for the league start when everybody is clamoring to get their Atlas completed as quickly as they can and start enacting their endgame strategies. So let's start with a little preamble. I think that there are some prerequisite pieces of knowledge you'll probably want to have before bothering to watch this video so that you get the most out of it. And essentially, I just think that you probably want to understand mapping fundamentals. And so we're just talking about things like what the map is, what the atlas is. There's such things as map completion, map tiers, white, yellow, red maps, etc. If some of that stuff that I just rambled off sounds foreign to you, then you probably want to go get a little bit of mapping experience, or at the very least, go consume some content that covers those real basics, because I'm going to be assuming that you're familiar with that information already when I present the info today. And then I just want to be clear on what we're talking about in this video and what the scope of it is. So it is outside the scope of this video to talk about sort of other sources of Atlas passive acquisition. We'll touch on where they come from, but this isn't going to be a detailed guide about how to get those as quickly or efficiently as possible. The focus is on map completion, and everything else will just sort of be a cursory mention for completeness sake. And the other thing I want to be clear on is we're not talking about spending Atlas passives. I'll just right up front say that there are some Atlas passives you can spend which affect the things I'm talking about, like they affect Kirac missions and they affect map drops. And so if you want to utilize some of those passives, that's great, but we're not talking about an Atlas passive strategy here, right? I'm not telling you how to spend your points. I'm just telling you how to get the points quickly and efficiently so that you can spend them on whatever you want. And what I hope to accomplish, the information I hope to get out to you, is that, I want to present tools for efficient map completion that aren't reliant on trade. They're tools that are highly accessible, and what I mean by highly accessible is that they don't depend on any particular engagement with any particular content, right? These are all very, I guess, generic tools that are accessible no matter what your Atlas strategy is, like what you want to spend your Atlas passive points on and what content you want to engage with. This is just kind of generically available tools and content that you can utilize to the fullest degree to maximize completion. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is with the different methods of map completion, map acquisition that we're going to cover today, what order to do things in, how do you prioritize things, what do you do first to maximize the odds of you getting the maps, gaining access to the maps that you need to for completion. Just to be clear too, if you are somebody who really enjoys engaging with trade, then it is absolutely optimal to incorporate trade into your strategy. But I wanted something that not only was useful for folks who play solo self-found, but is also useful for folks who find trade to be sort of a necessary evil, like myself. And so maybe I'm projecting here a little bit, but I feel like there are a lot of people out there who don't really enjoy the trading process. They enjoy it in so much as it, helps facilitate character progression and stuff. But if you can minimize the need to interact with it, then all the better for your gameplay experience. So, but if you do engage with trade and you enjoy it, and that's totally fine, of course, then just understand that you'll probably want to incorporate trade at some level to maximize the acquisition of Atlas passive points. And then another thing we want to cover is map drops, just how they work. And this is key for understanding the why and the how of manipulating probabilities in your favor so that you make it more likely that maps that you need to drop do drop. Just to quickly touch on the other sources of atlas progression, and I'm using this term to basically describe anything which provides sort of some means of modifying, enhancing, or customizing your endgame experience. You gain access to additional tools that you don't have when you first gain access to the atlas as you progress throughout. And I just felt like it was worth mentioning some of these things, especially because some of them feed into what I'm going to talk about later. And so the first one to mention is Void Stones. And Void Stones are rewards you get for killing some of the Pinnacle Atlas bosses the first time. And Void Stones can be socketed into your Atlas and provide a few different functions. Number one is you can apply sextants to them. If you're not super familiar with them, they're consumable items that apply modifiers to the Void Stones that then influence any map you run while the Void Stone is socketed. They have a limited number of charges that get consumed each time you run a map. And usually it's just stuff like adding extra monsters or certain reward types or forcing certain types of content to spawn. There's also a map drop tier bonus, so it increases the odds that you drop higher tier maps. We're going to go into more detail about how that works later, but just know that each Void Stone you socket increases the chance by 25% that the tier of the map that drops one tier higher than it would have without the bonus. And then finally, it increases the tier of all the maps on your atlas globally. So all maps have sort of a native tier, right? It's just the tier that they appear at without the Void Stone socketed. And then as you socket those Void Stones into your atlas, it will raise all the tiers of your maps until all 4 are socketed, and it makes every single map on your atlas a tier 16. And of course, it's a sort of gradual progression to that point as you socket 1, 2, and 3 Void Stones. So as you can see, these are very key to atlas progression. They have a lot of wide-ranging effects, including some interactions with map drops that we're going to talk about later. There is the 5th map device slot. This comes from running a 4-way Legion encounter. Again, we're not going to go into detail about what this is. I guess when I say what this is, how you get to the point of being able to run a 4-way and what a 4-way is and all that. Just search around for Legion and you will find that kind of information. I'm sure it's on the PoE wiki. But essentially, by default, in your map device, when you pop it open, there are 4 slots in there. 1 space you can put a map in, and then there are 3 spots for fragments, so you can put scarabs or something like a sacrifice fragment in there to enhance the quantity bonus on your map. You get an additional slot unlocked by running the 4-way Legion encounter, and thus it just allows you to juice your maps a little bit more. It's not super critical to anything we're talking about today. Usually by the time you get to that point, you will have completed most of your atlas, or maybe all of it. But anyway, I just felt like it was worth mentioning because it is a part of atlas progression. There are also Kirac mods. There's not too much to talk about here, but these are the mods that when you open your map device, you're provided a few options to sort of enhance the difficulty or rewards on your map. Or I guess in the case of these mods, just force certain kinds of content to spawn. The default option is that you just get a modest quantity bonus for any map you're running. But as you progress through your atlas and you complete more maps, more of these mods will unlock, and you'll have the ability to spend increasing amounts of chaos orbs to force certain types of content to spawn on your map. Again, not super critical for what we're talking about today, but still just worth mentioning that it exists. And then finally, there are your favorite map slots. So there are a bunch of these that all have sort of a different objective that must be completed to unlock it. And you get 12 or 13 of them. I actually forget off the top of my head what it is. But the favorite map slot makes it so that when you choose a map somewhere on your atlas and select it to be in one of your favorite slots, it makes it 10 times more likely to drop. And you can use any combination of maps in them. You can do all of them the same map or one map in each different one that are all 10 times more likely to drop. It's up to you. But anyway, just another form of atlas progression. Most of these things, like I say, don't have too much influence on what we're talking about today, except just to cover them for completeness sake, except for the void stones. Again, we'll come back to some of the stuff related to that in just a moment. And then I also just wanted to quickly gloss over the various sources of atlas passives, and then we'll kind of get into the real meat of things. So there are 132 total atlas passives. They're very, very strong. It's, one of the reasons I felt like it was worthwhile to make this video. I think everybody that has had some in-game experience appreciates the power and sort of fun that comes along with gaining these passives and spending them. But maps grant you 115 of these passives. 100 of them come from non-unique maps, and actually the non-unique portion is kind of what we're going to focus on. We're going to touch on the unique component a bit as well, but the focus is on the non-unique maps. And Maven Invitations provides you the next 11. It's a combination of the special invitations as well as the map boss invitations. And then there are 6 different Pinnacle Atlas boss encounters that each provide you with an Atlas passive, and this totals up to 132. So again, we're focusing though on the map portion. Okay, so now we're starting to get into it. So here are the sources of map acquisition and completion that I'm going to be covering today. Again, keep in mind, I tried to limit it to strategies that don't require trade and are accessible no matter what Atlas strategy you're using. Just keep in mind, if you're aware of some additional source of map acquisition or completion that is usable with whatever league content you plan to engage with, certainly incorporate that. There's, of course, that's a good idea for you, but I just didn't want to make any assumptions about what everybody's going to be doing. And if I wanted to touch on every little mechanic and every different, piece of league content that's out there, this video would get really out of control really quickly. So this is kind of just like the core pieces that you'll want probably for any Atlas completion strategy. So we're going to be talking about map drops. Like I said, that's a lot of it, just because the map drop system can be a little bit obtuse, and this is where you have a lot of the flexibility to sort of maximize your odds in getting the maps that you want. Then we're going to be talking about Kirac, both his inventory and Atlas missions, and then of course the scouting reports that you can drop as well. The 3-to-1 vendor recipe, we'll go into more detail about what that is, but essentially you can sell 3 of one map to get a map 1 tier higher, and then the Orb of Horizons. So these are the tools that we're going to stick with today. If you remember nothing else from this video, the key concept is that of these different tools, you want to focus on using tools which afford less control early. They're more highly randomized, and you have fewer opportunities to sort of roll the dice with them. Use those early, and then preserve the tools which you can manipulate the odds with, right? Which afford greater control for later. And that just sort of should make sense, right? When something is totally random, because you don't have the control, you want to be able to maximize the value of whatever those random offerings are. Whereas with tools that allow greater control, well, you can do things to then sort of fill in the gaps that the more random sources of map acquisition and completion did not provide you. So that's the key concept. If you remember nothing else, remember that. All right, so map drops. This is one of the sources of completion that provides a pretty high level of control for the most part. And we're going to first start by kind of walking you through the order of operations, how the game decides what kind of map, what specific map it's going to drop you at any given time. So when the game decides that it's going to drop a map for you, the first thing it does is choose the map tier. Now, I don't know if there's any particular weighting related to tier. It seems like there probably is. I couldn't find any reliable information about what that weighting is, but the bottom line is that the first thing it does is choose a map tier. Now, there are only maps in the pool of available maps can drop. Now, what constitutes this pool? It's two things, which are maps you've completed, and we're talking about basic completion, not the bonus completion objective. So basic map completion, the only thing it does actually is, as far as I know, is add the map to the map drop pool. That's it. Bonus completion is kind of generally colloquially what people are referring to when they refer to completion, because that's what gets you your Atlas passive. Then you have adjacent maps. So when you're looking at the Atlas, and actually I'm going to go back a few slides here, when you're looking at the Atlas, you can see any given map has little threads running from it to nearby maps that physically connect to them on this Atlas. Those are the adjacent maps. So whatever map you happen to be running, the maps that have threads connecting to it are in the map drop pool and can be dropped from a random drop from killing a monster. There is also a maximum possible tier that can roll. Magic and rare monsters can drop a map that is whatever the current tier of map you're running is, +1. And this is a hard cap, by the way. It cannot be exceeded. I'm not aware of any way in which you can exceed this number. And map bosses can drop maps that are 2 tiers higher than your current map. Now, I've seen, the reason I say maybe uniques here, I've seen conflicting information on this. I spent quite a bit of time trying to really get a firm answer as to whether or not this is only map bosses, or if there are other unique monsters or certain unique monsters that can drop maps that are 2 tiers higher. And I couldn't find anything reliable. I saw some conflicting information from things that I thought were like sort of reliable sources, like pretty knowledgeable people in the game, but nothing from GGG or anything like that. So feel free to throw something in the comments if you are quite confident, especially if you have a source you can point to reference this information. But anyway, to be perfectly honest, it's not super important that you know this detail anyway. It just bothered me a little bit that I couldn't really get a firm answer here. So the next thing that happens after the map tier is chosen is a tier bonus is applied if possible. Now, if you think back to the Void Stones that we talked about earlier, Void Stones, as I mentioned, each provide you with a 25% chance to drop a map a tier higher than it would have dropped without the Void Stone. So after the tier is chosen, you get that chance to boost it up a tier. And with the Void Stones, because there's 4 and they're 25% each, the Void Stones themselves give you a 100% chance to raise the tier, which means that the map is guaranteed to drop 1 tier higher, save for those hard caps that I mentioned earlier, right? If you're running a tier 12 map and the game decides in step 1 that you're going to drop a tier 12 map from a white monster, that bonus doesn't matter. It can't raise it to tier 13 because it would break those rules mentioned earlier. But any other choice that it makes, it'll boost it up a tier. Now, another interesting thing is that going above 100% chance on this is not wasted. Instead, what happens is the first 100% chance that you get guarantees an upgrade of 1 tier. Any additional chance on top of that is sort of a separate roll, acts like a separate roll to boost the tier a second time. So if, for example, you had a 150% chance to raise the map tier drop, the first 100% chance would guarantee that it raises a tier. The next 50% would be a 50% chance that instead it raises 2 tiers. So pretty powerful stat, as you can imagine, as you're trying to climb up into higher and higher tier maps. Then a specific map is selected. So from within that pool that is sort of referenced earlier, it chooses a specific map, and there are some bonuses that make it more likely. And this is sort of where the odds manipulation comes in. There are bonuses that make it more likely for specific maps to drop. So if a map is adjacent to the one that you're currently running, it is 4 times more likely to drop. If it is also incomplete, then it is another 2 times more likely to drop, and this is multiplicative. So adjacent incomplete maps are 8 times more likely to drop. And adjacent complete maps, ones that you've already completed, are 4 times more likely to drop. So part of the reason up top is where I mentioned the sort of map pool rather than down here with the specific map selection is only because it is actually possible for the game to select a tier that has no maps in the pool. And that might seem weird, but there's a number of ways in which this can happen. But one example is if you kill a map boss, and let's say you're in a tier 7 map, it's adjacent to 2 tier 8 maps and 2 tier 6 maps. But it's not adjacent to any tier 9 maps. And the map boss can drop a map that's 2 tiers higher than what you're currently in, and the game decides it wants to drop you a tier 9 map while you're in a tier 7. And you've completed 0 tier 9 maps. You've found none yet. Completed 0. That means there's none in the pool. You're not adjacent to any tier 9 maps, and you haven't completed any. So it's not possible for the game to drop you a tier 9 map. Despite that fact, it still chooses that tier. Now, that brings us into something called map equity, which the game has so it doesn't sort of waste the value that you would have derived from that map drop. And we'll touch on that in just a moment. I just wanted to circle back and mention one more thing related to the specific map selection and these 2 bonuses. If it, excuse me, if it looks weird that I say it's 2 times more likely if it's also incomplete, because you can have maps that are incomplete and not adjacent, well, you cannot drop maps that are incomplete and not adjacent, right? It either has to be adjacent or completed. So there's no such, right? You'll never have a map that only has this 2 times multiplier bonus. It either has the 4 times multiplier bonus, the 8 times multiplier bonus from both of them combined, or neither one if it's just a map in the pool. Anyway, you can see how that's why I hint down here that this is one of the strategies that gives you a high level of control over what drops. There's still some randomness to it, yes, but you have quite a high level of control over what drops. 8 times more likely is a big deal. Okay, let's circle back to map equity, which I referenced before. One quick little preface before I even say anything about this. Honestly, it's not that important that you understand this. I just, knowing people who play Path of Exile, you're probably curious about it. But really knowing how it works doesn't help you very much. So if you want to just skip past this because you're not curious, you don't care, and you just want to move on, go for it. But anyway, map equity, the way it works is some people sort of refer to it as something like an automatic 3-to-1 recipe, because it's kind of like it's upgrading maps in the background. It's not the best analogy, but it gets the idea across that you're taking value from maps that couldn't drop, right? Remember here when I described the game rolling a map tier in which there are no valid drops? Well, rather than just losing the value of that map because it couldn't drop, the game actually sort of stores the value of that map in the background in almost like a sort of bank account for map value for you that you will cash in later. And I say you, the game cashes in automatically for you. And so a tier 1 map has a value of 1 in this system. A tier 16 map has a value of 14 million something or other. It just goes up by powers of 3. And this is partly why people think of it as a 3-to-1 recipe, because it sort of describes their value, in terms of that 3-to-1 recipe. So a tier 1 map is 1 equity, tier 2 is 3 equity, tier 3 is 9 equity, 27, 81, etc., etc. So all the way up to 14 some million. Now, what happens is this equity value, when you are unable to drop a map, it gets stored in this account. And then the game decides that it's going to see if you have enough equity to drop a different tier map. And so the way it works is, first, after it fails the drop, right, there's no valid drops and it stores the equity. It then, before dropping nothing, checks to see if it can drop you a better map instead, or I should say a higher tier map. And so it will start by attempting to drop you the highest tier map possible. So that goes back to these rules right here related to the tier of the map you're in and the type of monster you killed when the map drop was rolled, right? Either for a normal monster, it's equal to the tier of the map you're in. For a magic and rare, it's +1. For a map boss and maybe uniques, it's +2. Now, so if it fails and stores the equity for you, then it checks, okay, the equity you just gained plus all the equity you've stored up, your total equity, does that equal whatever the highest tier possible map is for you? If it does, or more, then it drops that and then it subtracts that equity, right? It pulls out a particular equity value and then gives you that, that map instead. So just thinking about the equity values I referenced earlier, tier 2 is 3, tier 3 is 9, 4, 27. So tier 5 maps are 81 equity. So if you have at least 81 equity and tier 5 is the highest possible map that it can drop, then the game removes 81 equity from your pool and then drops the tier 5 map. Now, if it can't drop the highest possible tier, then it checks the next tier below it, and it just keeps on going down and checking lower and lower tiers until it gets to the tier you were at before. So the map equity system will never drop you a map that is a lower tier than the original map that failed to drop for you, right? And so in the case that I just described and the examples that I've been using so far, that describes a situation where it's a map higher tier than what you're in now, and you simply aren't adjacent or connected to any maps of that tier yet. But void stones can create a similar situation with lower tier maps. Because if you remember, and just to make the example as easy as possible, when you have 4 void stones socketed into your map, every map on your atlas is tier 16. What that means is that no maps that are not tier 16 can drop. It won't happen. Every map is now a tier 16, so tier 16 is the only valid drop. And so if you're in a situation where the game decides it's going to drop you a tier 12 map, well, it can't do that. There are no tier 12 maps, so there's nothing in the pool for you. And so, and this is true even for adjacent maps and such, right? Because, yeah, the adjacent maps are in the pool, but the adjacent maps, none of them are of that tier, right? Every adjacent map is tier 16 in that scenario. And so this is a situation now where you're accumulating equity from sort of lower value maps that eventually you'll accumulate enough to cash in to drop a tier 16 instead. And so that's another one of the powers of the Void Stones, is it basically culls out shitty map drops. Tiers that you are obsolete to you, you don't care about anymore. You can't drop them any longer. And so, it makes sure that you're only getting relevant map tiers to drop. So that's the map equity system. Again, understanding it in detail isn't really that important. but just know that it's going to help you along the way as you progress your Atlas, get your Void Stones and all that. Okay, so now we go into Kirac. So Kirac has a couple of mechanics, actually a few mechanics that all there's some interplay between them. And so Kirac Shop is one that provides you limited control, but it is essentially just a big inventory of maps that he sells you. And there's a couple of other non-map, or I should say they're map-related items that he'll sell you as well, such as sextants he'll sometimes sell you divination cards, a few other things, orbs of unmaking for respecking your Atlas passives. But the main thing we care about in this strategy is he sells you maps. And the tier of map that he offers you, it goes up as your Atlas progression moves forward, right? As you start completing higher and higher tier maps, he'll start offering you higher and higher tier maps. So he kind of keeps up with you in terms of his inventory offerings. Also understand that the map cost, you have to pay him, he's a vendor, increases with tier and rarity. And initially, everything costs a combination of chance orbs and scrolls of wisdom. Eventually, alchemy orbs start to become part of the cost, and then eventually chaos orbs can also become part of the cost. And so it's generally speaking, white maps involve chance orbs, yellow maps, alchemy orbs, red maps, chaos orbs. And I think there's a little bit of blending there, if I remember correctly, but that's kind of like loosely the kind of currency you'll see things priced at. Now, because the map cost increases with tier and rarity, my suggestion is that early on, you don't, if you have the option of buying lower rarity maps, you want to buy them instead. It's not worth paying additional chance or alchemy orbs for maps, unless you just need the map to be a rare map, right? If it's a yellow map, then maybe that's fine if it costs an additional alchemy orb. But, you know, especially in white maps, when you only need it to be a magic map, you'd much rather spend a transmutation orb on the map than you would a chance orb, because they're going to be limited and you're going to be spending these like crazy early on. It will be a limited resource. So just keep that in mind, that generally you want to stick with the lower rarity maps. And if you're really constrained on currency, like you don't have enough to buy all the maps that he's offering that you haven't completed yet, then you can just stick with the lowest tier offerings, because you'll just get more of them that way. Another thing to keep in mind is if you flip on the advanced tooltip, if you weren't aware of this, it will show you as you hover over the maps in the inventory whether you've completed them or gained the bonus completion objective on the maps, which makes it really handy. You can just scan through his inventory and see which offerings he's providing that you actually care about. Part of the interplay here is that the inventory, his offerings reset after you do a Kirac mission. So you always want to check the inventory and clean out any offerings he has and run any maps that he's offering that you haven't completed yet before you go back and do more missions, if possible. Because, you know, you want to take advantage. Again, this is one of those that's highly random, and so you don't want to miss out on random offerings that would have been useful, and instead go make a choice with the missions and end up running something that you could have purchased from him and then but had the option of choosing a different mission when you go the mission route. So focus on the shop first. Shop is higher priority, or I should say I guess the first step in terms of the sort of like Kirac mechanic engagement. Start there always at the shop, clear that out as much as you can, and then check the missions. Also worth noting that sometimes this inventory will change like after a patch or something like that too. So there's some random things outside of your control that can result in the inventory being cleared out. Okay, next, Kirac missions. So this is another one where you have pretty limited control. Scouting reports give you some additional layers of control, but I'm kind of talking about that separately here. But basically, he's going to offer you, a random assortment of maps that are already rolled, already modified in some way, and any that you can run that meet the criteria for bonus completion. Go ahead and run them if you haven't completed them yet. Again, once you've cleared out the shop. So, because the completion bonus on this does apply to your Atlas. Now, your Atlas passives don't apply to the maps you run through Kirac. Like, you don't get those bonuses applied to it, but the reverse does work, where you complete the maps in his missions, and it does grant you the completion or bonus completion on your Atlas. As I said, it resets the shop inventory. We already kind of went over that. And another thing to keep in mind here is that he is an excellent source of unique maps. One of the best ways to get unique maps in the game is from him. Outside of trade, of course. But he very frequently offers unique maps. I say very frequently compared to how often you'll encounter them as random drops out in the world. So keep that in mind. It is really, really useful for that. It is also worth noting that both his missions and his shop, he offers influenced maps a pretty decent amount of the time. That doesn't really matter for completion, but I'm just throwing that out there because that does help you with some of the other forms of Atlas progression I talked about earlier, like getting some of your other Atlas passives, unlocking favorite slots, etc. Some of that will require those things. So just a quick little mention, keep your eye out for those influenced maps as well, if they're going to help those other, sort of layers of Atlas progression that we discussed earlier. And then finally, scouting reports. So there are a number of them, and I only mention a few here. There are a few other types that are not listed on here. But they offer varying levels of control over the missions that are available to you. Essentially, if you're unfamiliar with these, it's a consumable item that when you consume it, it rerolls all the mission offerings, and sometimes with sort of additional criteria or bonuses. And so the one I've highlighted here is the Explorer's Map. This one is amazing because it heavily favors maps that you haven't completed. So obviously, for a strategy where you're trying to complete all the maps as quickly as you possibly can, having an item that you can consume that just offers you exactly what you need is pretty amazing. So yeah, I tend to save these a lot until I sort of hit like roadblocks where, I'm at a point that I don't have any maps I can run at that very moment, which would grant me a bonus completion objective. And, I'm at a point where I would just be sort of farming, right? I'd just be running a few maps in order to try and get the drops I want. Those are the points at which I generally will use these because of how much control they offer you in terms of getting exactly what you need. I mention a couple of others here because they also are great at improving the odds that the missions he's offering you are useful in some way. And so the comprehensive scouting reports do just result in more mission offerings, which means it's just more likely he's going to offer you something useful. And then the singular scouting reports guarantee a unique map. So in addition to what I said earlier, where he tends to be a pretty good source of unique maps, these guys guarantee unique maps, and every single one of them is another Atlas passive. We're not focusing on that in this discussion that much because you can't control those drops so much in the same way. There are some things you can do, but it's not really worth going into too much. But anyway, this offers you another way of, at least getting your first several unique maps completed pretty quickly. So really, really useful tool. Okay, next is the 3-to-1 vendor recipe. So this one offers you a modest level of control, and the amount of control you get from it varies significantly with the number of that map you have. So to be clear, just in case I wasn't clear earlier when I glossed over it, the 3-to-1 recipe is when you take 3 of the same map, sell them to the vendor, and he sells you back a random map that is 1 tier higher. And when I say the same map, I mean literally the same name, right? You sell him 3 tropical islands, you sell him 3 beach maps, whatever. He'll sell you 1 random map a tier higher. It will always be... Now, it doesn't care about the native tier of the map you're selling him. So as long as they're 3 maps of the same type and the same tier, because Voidstones can sort of mess with that, right? You could have a tier 1 beach map, you could have a tier 5 beach map, you could have a tier 10, depending on how many Voidstones you had socketed at the time that it dropped. So they all need to be the same tier and the same name map. But what he'll sell you back, it will always be a map that is 1 tier higher and that exists at that as its native tier, right? So Voidstones don't influence what return you can get from the vendor. So the other thing is that each map has its own sort of like seed or ID number. I don't know exactly how it works, but the important part to know is that the exact same 3 maps, if you sell them, the vendor's always going to give you the exact same thing in return. And you can preview what he's going to give you too. So you don't have to hit the accept button, you don't have to hit the buy button until you've already previewed exactly what you're going to get. And you can use your advanced mod tooltip to see if it's a map you've completed already, which is pretty awesome. So if you have 3 maps, you'll always get, if you have 3 tropical islands, you sell it to the vendor, you'll always get the exact same map 1 tier higher back. Now, if you have 4 maps, all of the sudden, there's now 4 different combinations that you can make out of those, right? You can sell maps A, B, and C. You can sell A, B, and D. You can sell B, C, D. You can sell A, B, D. I think I got all 4. Maybe I said one of them twice. Anyway, the point is that those 4 combinations potentially all result in a different map being sold back to you. I mean, some of them could be the same through random chance, but you have 4 chances of different maps being offered back to you by the vendor. And so it behooves you to save this method a little bit for a couple of reasons. Number one is you don't really want to use maps at a tier that's like still relevant to you in a 3-to-1 recipe, because you could just run the maps instead. So it's really, really great for filling in gaps once you're kind of like a tier or 2 above that map and you don't care about that map tier so much anymore, right? You've completed most of them. You don't really want to drop back to running maps a tier or 2 lower than you're capable of. Now all of a sudden you don't care about using that resource in that way. The other reason though is because the more you save, just because of the way combinatorial math works, the more you save, the more chances you get. And I made a quick little table here that indicates this to you. So when you have 3 maps, well, there's only 1 combination, right? You have 4 maps, there's 4 combinations, 5 maps up to 10. So if you have a pool of 10 maps, you have 120 different ways of combining them so that you can potentially get a different map sold back to you or, traded to you from the vendor. And so it's definitely worth it. I mean, you probably don't need to go up to 10 maps. I just showed up to 10 just because it's an arbitrary number to stop at. But, getting to 5, 6, 7 maps somewhere in here is probably a sweet spot where you realistically could accumulate that number of maps. And then all of a sudden, it's pretty likely that you can get exactly what you want. If there's, and I'm just making up numbers here, let's pretend there are 7 different tier 5 maps. Well, if you have, and you're only missing one of them, right? You've completed 6, you have the bonus completion on 6, and the 7th one you're missing. Well, if you have 7 tier 4 maps, you have 35 chances of getting that exact one that you need. So all of a sudden, it's pretty deterministic, right? I mean, technically you could miss, 1 out of 7, 35 times in a row, but it's not particularly likely. So that's why I say, there's varying levels of control here, but what you do by saving up a little bit before you utilize this is you're making this essentially a guarantee, or pretty darn close to it. So worth holding out on this as long as you can. The other thing I would mention is that it also gives you a chance to sort of fill in those gaps with other means in the meantime, right? So as you're checking Kirac's inventory and you're checking his mission offerings and stuff, all of a sudden, you're periodically going to run into a good offering from his inventory or from his missions that fill in a gap just perfectly for you, and you don't even need to bother with the 3-to-1 recipe. Okay, the last thing we're going to touch on, and then we're going to start to wrap up here, is the Orb of Horizons. So the Orb of Horizons offers very limited control. I mean, I say that, except that it's always... So let me say what they do first, actually. In case you're unfamiliar, you haven't really used them. It re-rolls a map to another map of the same tier. So, and it always will re-roll to a map at, like a native tier. So this makes it so that however many maps there are at that tier, that you have a 1 over that many chance of hitting what you want. I guess technically -1, because it will never re-roll the same thing, I'm pretty sure. So I suggest you use these aggressively, because they're not worth a ton, and it's a resource that you're just not really going to be consuming in any other way early on. You don't really need them for anything else. So I think that essentially once you get to a point, I mean, you don't want to re-roll a map that you could just run to get a completion bonus, but as soon as you drop a copy of a map that you've already completed and you're fairly open at that tier, just throw a Horizon Orb on it. Boom, just give it a shot. Just, spin the wheel. Why not? Because of how random it is, I think it's totally worth it to just throw these things away willy-nilly early on. You're really not giving up that much value. There are a couple of very specific niche instances where they're really useful later on, like, for example, re-rolling Shaper Guardian maps and stuff like that. But for the most part, you're not going to feel bad about just really aggressively using these to maximize completion early on. The other thing is that this helps you save your Kirac shop currencies. So if you're light on Chance Orbs, you're light on Alchemy Orbs, you're light on Chaos Orbs early in the league. And you're probably going to be, especially if you're in SSF, then you're basically converting these into those currencies that you care more about. Because anytime you nab, something that you would have purchased from Kirac instead, all of a sudden you're converting this Horizon Orb into 3 Chance Orbs, or 4 Alchemy Orbs, or 3 Chaos Orbs, or whatever it is. And most of the time, I think you're pretty happy to do that. Okay, a lot of rambling from me, as is the huge if you've watched any of my other content. But let's wrap up here. So the key concept, again, if you take away nothing else from this video, of the tools that I mentioned here, and kind of keep this concept in mind if you use any league content specific tools as well, use the tools that are high variance and provide very limited control over the outcomes first, and preserve the tools that are much more deterministic for later. Also keep in mind sort of how much of a scarce resource you need to use in order to access a particular method. Again, talking about like the currencies you spend at Kirac's shop, and in the 3-to-1 recipe, the maps themselves are a resource, that kind of thing. So kind of keep that in mind as a secondary factor with this. The other sort of closing thought I wanted to throw out there is that optimal is sometimes suboptimal. So if any of you had your sort of gears cooking, if you were unfamiliar with how map drops work, and you heard me talking about this, and you started thinking about ways to really min-max the odds that you get what you want, you can do all kinds of quirky stuff where you actually hold on to maps and don't complete them right away, because this allows you to take advantage of, getting that 8 times multiplier that I described earlier. You can then selectively run maps to sort of partially soft block them, and then, cut the multiplier back to 4 times. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't even worry about it. But, we're just talking about really min-maxing the drop rate multipliers for specific maps in the map drop pool. There are ways to do this. I don't think it's worth it. I think it's too clunky. It doesn't feel natural. You get in this weird situation where you have to start remembering what maps you've run, because now all of a sudden, when you check Kirac's shop and his missions, and because you're holding on to maps, you actually, it says the map's not completed, but you might already have it in your inventory, so you don't care. So you end up doing this thing where you're like looking in Kirac's inventory and then going back to your inventory and scanning through, okay, these are the 4 or 5 maps I'm holding on to. It's clunky, obnoxious. It consumes time. So whatever boost to the odds that you get might be sort of offset by the additional time you spend doing that. And then, of course, you're also, you're delaying the bonuses that you could be getting from the Atlas passives themselves, which give you pretty powerful bonuses. And so even if technically it's optimal, it just sucks to do, is the bottom line. I think it takes the fun out of it. I mean, if you're the kind of person who the way you derive fun is by min-maxing everything to the nth degree, and there are plenty of people like that who play PoE, fine, keep that in mind. But I'm not really going to talk about that in any more depth. Every time I've tried to do it, I hate it. I don't think it's worth it. I actually was originally planning on laying out a flow chart in this presentation describing sort of the decision tree to follow to maximize these odds. I think it's not worth it. I think I would have spent a ton of time telling you to do something that sucks and offers very marginal improvements over just, as soon as you get the thing from whatever source, just go complete it. It just feels much more natural that way. All that said, if it is something you want to do, just keep in mind, for it to work, so that you're not wasting a bunch of time, going back and forth, comparing, trying to remember what maps that you're holding on to and all that kind of stuff. Just plan it out first, so that you reduce that time wasted. So that's it. That is the set of tips I'm offering you to progress through your Atlas more quickly. Hopefully it helps. I am, just as a side note, I am excited about Crucible League. Just a quick little drop on the starter. I'm going to play Tectonic Slam Juggernaut. I saw the passive that you can potentially get for Tectonic Slam is where you get % increased damage per 450 armor. I'm assuming that's for a 2-handed weapon, which is a pretty substantial boost, because I was already thinking about going Jug, taking advantage of the new Mastery node that lets 10% of your armor apply to incoming chaos damage, also speccing his built-in node that lets 8% of your armor apply to elemental damage, going Divine Flesh and being an absolute tank god. And then, all that armor that I want to be scaling would also be scaling my damage. So that's a quick little nutshell of what I'm planning on doing. I'm excited for it. I love more skill trees. Give me more skill trees. Yes. PoE doing what it does well. All right. That's it. That's enough rambling. I will see you folks in Crucible League. Take it easy.